We're here to bring a new type of news show.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation.
Bringing news just for you. It's Tuesday, December 9th here in Seoul. I'm Isujin, and this is News Generation. And joining us today is Tae.
Hello, happy Tuesday.
Good to have you, and also Kim's with us.
Good morning.
Good morning. And both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. So it's only Tuesday, but a lot of people are already feeling the weight of the week. But while we go about our routines, there's a whole group of people working behind the scenes to make sure our workplaces run fairly. So today we're going to dive into a topic that hits close to home for anyone who's ever had a job. So let's start with a simple question. So Kyun, have you ever joined a labor union?
No, I actually haven't. But in the past, as working as a full-timer, I did have, I guess, good reasons to join the labor union. But I wasn't really aware of the overall system and what benefits I could receive as an employee, or even the just details and information. So I never actually ended up joining one. But looking back, there were several times where I could have gained a lot of advice, consultation, and a lot of help in return if I had been registered as a member. But now, currently as a freelancer, I never really thought about joining a labor union even more compared to the past. But it is something to look into, further into, because for my own protection, for my working rights, and for my voices to be heard on a louder level in a more serious, practical way. So this is what we're going to talk about today, and I hope everyone can tune in to find out more about what the labor union means to the MZ generation.
And before we do that, so what was your experience like with?
I've never been part of a labor union either, like Ki-hoon. Right now, I work as a freelancer, just like you again. So joining a union isn't as simple as it is for full-time employees. And even if there are unions related to broadcasting, freelancers like me have different contracts, different employers, and we often move from one project to another. So it feels more complicated to belong to a single organization that represents us. And before I started working in the broadcasting industry, I worked as a regular office worker for a short period of time. But even then, I didn't really think about joining a union because at the time I was new to the workplace. So I was more focused on fitting in, learning the culture, the work, and the people. So yeah, that's my experience.
So between the three of us, there's different perspectives that we can share today. So we're going to dive deeper into this topic. But first, let's basically look at the screen. Labor unions have long been a cornerstone of the workplace created to protect workers' rights and ensure fair conditions. And while they've been around for decades, we're now seeing something new, a wave of fresh energy driven by Gen Z and millennials. Their active participation is reshaping what unions look like and how they operate. Today on News Generation, we're taking a closer look at how these younger unions differ from traditional ones, what defines their unique characteristics, and how the ones in Korea compare to the movements young workers are leading overseas. So as we just saw in the video, young people today are taking a much more active role in unions, using them as a way to make their voices heard and push for change in their workplaces. We're really seeing a noticeable shift in how the millennial and Gen Z generations approach organizing collective action. So Kyun, what recent examples stand out to you that show just how active younger workers have become in this space?
So to begin, Seoul Metro's third union called 올바른 Labor Union announced it will go on an all-out strike starting on this Friday, the 12th, following the lead of the first union. So Seoul Metro and the union are set to have their final negotiations on this Thursday, and that will decide the outcome of the strike. And hence it would in turn affect, depending on the outcome, affect people like us who actually use public transport in the Seoul metropolitan area. And what's especially noticeable is that most of the union's members are MZ workers, millennials and Gen Zs. And it's not just happening in the public sector. In major conglomerates, we're seeing MZ-led unions emerge as well. At Samsung Electronics, an MZ-driven cross-company union, which was launched in 2024, has already grown in numbers up to 20,000 members. At LG Electronics, as you see on the screen, the company formed its first ever white-collar union back in 2021, also largely led by younger employees, called the Human Centered Office Workers Union. So we're seeing through these examples, many young workers who are actively involved in these labor unions, just showing that they're willing to use these kind of formal collective action in spaces where it used to be quite rare compared to our parents' generation, where our parents who were around our age weren't so interested, or they were kind of like reluctant to join these labor unions because it was mostly for people who are much older, who have more experience in the workforce. But now it's the other way around, where it's not so much about how long you've been in that particular workplace. It's about what's right and what's wrong, and what's fair and what's not.
Right.
So we're seeing these kind of new movements from the younger employees.
And it's interesting that these are younger employees, not just in one specific area, but you just mentioned public institutions to also large private companies. So are there actually numbers that show how much more of an active participation there is by young workers?
Yes, we are actually seeing some changes. If we look at the screen, according to a recent study by Statistics Korea, the unionization rate among workers in their 20s and younger rose from 8.1% in 2016 to 9.3% in 2021. The rate for workers in their 30s also increased from 14.3% to 15.8%. And a research team at Seoul National University has also reported that the millennials and Gen Zers are driving the rise in union membership in Korea. A concrete example of this trend is 새로 고침 노동자 협의회, which launched in 2023. And this is a coalition of several newly formed so-called MZ노조, MZ union groups, mostly comprised of people in their 20s and 30s. And plus, with the emergence of MZ-led labor unions, we are also seeing a tangible MZ effect in union membership and union culture, which we are going to delve into deeper later on.
And seeing so much participation from young people is probably leading other young workers to join as well. So
Yes.
what led to the emergence of these millennial and Gen Z unions in the first place, though, Kyun?
In South Korea, the labor movement has been dominated by two powerful umbrella federations. First one being the Korean Federation of Trade Unions, also known as KCTU, and the Federation of Korean Trade Unions, FKTU. But there's been growing criticism that these established unions haven't really fully met the expectations of what the millennials and Gen Zs actually want in the workplace, especially on day-to-day workplace issues, fairness and transparency. So what they've done is they've organized for themselves their own MZ-led unions that they feel better, that match their priorities and the style of engagement that's more practical, more direct, and more closely tied to their own experiences at work.
It must have felt quite frustrating for them to feel like their needs weren't being met by these traditional unions. So how are these unions that made up of younger people different from Korea's more traditional unions then?
So traditionally, many of Korea's unions were centered on blue-collar production line workers. And in many workplaces, office workers, employees weren't rightly unionized, and in some cases, they were actually excluded from joining one or even organizing one. But Korea's industrial landscape has shifted over the past decade or so. Today, a much larger share of the workforce is made up of office workers, researchers, engineers, and even developers. So millennials and Gen Zs have responded to that reality and that shift by forming unions that are built around these newer job categories, more white-collar and professional roles. So unions' agenda and representations actually match the modern workplace.
So the type of jobs that they're doing has also changed, which makes sense that a shift in who the unions represent must also influence how they operate and what issues they then focus on. So Seong, what would you say are the defining characteristics of these younger and newer unions?
Well, if traditional unions are often remembered for strong street rallies and the image of workers wearing red headbands while shaking their fist in the air while chanting and pushing for collective power, the new MZ-led unions operate quite differently. They are generally more moderate in tone and less focused on large-scale physical protest. And what they emphasize most is fairness, especially fair compensation for the work they do, and that reflects a broader value system of young people. They are less interested in ideology or political identity and more interested in whether the rules are transparent and whether rewards are distributed fairly. So you will notice that unions comprised of millennials and Gen Zs tend to mobilize not over classic wage disputes, but over things like hiring irregularities, unjust bonus systems, or pay gaps that feel unreasonable. In other words, their activism grows out of frustration with unfair processes rather than traditional class conflict. So, and that shift from ideology to fairness is becoming one of the key characteristics that sets these new unions apart.
I see. So that focus on fairness really stands out, especially compared to more, like a confrontational, more traditional image that we have of the traditional unions that you mentioned with the red headbands. And it looks like they're also focused on more day-to-day issues. So are there other specific issues or policies that younger worker unions tend to pay closer attention to, say,
Yes, there are. Again, younger worker unions in Korea often focused on a very different set of concerns compared to traditional labor groups. For example, issues like extending the retirement age or legislative changes such as the so-called Yellow Envelope Act, a bill aimed at limiting corporate lawsuits against striking workers, and the Severe Accident Punishment Act are typically welcomed by traditional unions because they strengthen worker protection. But many MZ-led unions take a more cautious, even conservative stance on the same policies. Their argument is that some of these protections may unintentionally create disadvantages for younger workers, especially job seekers and new employees just starting out. For example, if retirement is extended, it could narrow promotion opportunities or reduce the number of entry-level positions. And if strict protections are concentrated only on full-time workers, young people on contract or flexible work may feel even more excluded. So rather than simply favoring stronger protections, MZ unions tend to ask this question: will these policies be fair to those who are just entering the labor market? That fairness-focused perspective is what really distinguishes them.
So it sounds like the things that they're focusing on, and also it seems more moderate, like the whole environment around it. So what you said really helps explain why younger worker unions take such a different stance on these major policy debates, and their approach is clearly shaped by the realities younger workers face on a day-to-day basis right now. So to dig deeper into that perspective, we're going to hear from a young person currently studying politics and labor policy in the Netherlands. So that conversation is coming right after the break, so stay with us.
NewsGen wants to hear from you. Go to YouTube and search out Channel Arirang News. Click Posts and cast your vote in the poll. Make a new type of news with us.
Joining us today is Alanya, a university student in the Netherlands majoring in political science and international law. So hello, thank you so much for connecting with us today.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're glad to talk to you today. So from your experience living in Western Europe and also South Africa, where you're originally from, how actively are young people getting involved in unions today?
So from my experience in Western Europe, particularly in Austria and the Netherlands, there's quite some difference. In the Netherlands, for example, there has been a very stark decline in union membership overall. While young people do believe that unions are more effective than older people believe, the numbers are still declining. However, interestingly, a lot more women are joining labor unions in the Netherlands, which I think is an interesting trend. And Austria, on the other hand, shows how institutional support matters. So the government has institutionalized some labor unions where all employees automatically become members, and this ensures that young workers automatically have representation. And research also shows that apprentices and young workers believe in the effectiveness of political participation when they are represented at the workplace. So this proves that when young people see unions working, they also engage with them. In South Africa, on the other hand, union membership is also declining starkly. I think there's been a 20% decrease in the past 6-7 years. And the youth often view unions as outdated and sometimes overly political and kind of stuck in old political rhetoric. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that there's an anti-union sentiment. Young people do understand that there are labor issues, but there is some lack of knowledge about what unions are useful for, and they don't really see the relevance to modern work arrangements. But where I see a similarity between all three of the countries is that young workers everywhere really face precarious employment and want representation from unions.
I see. Then how would you compare the way young workers in Western Europe engage with unions to what we're seeing here in Korea?
I think a very fundamental difference lies in its political socialization. For example, in many European countries, teenagers as young as 12 become politically active through youth wings of their political parties. So they start participating in marketing and going to debates and so on and so forth. And this early participation normalizes labor unions as a simple part of civic life. Whereas, if I understand correctly, in Korea, public political identification is really rare, especially for young people. And so this cultural difference creates fundamentally different attitudes towards collective worker representation. And as I mentioned before, we are seeing some belated but significant legal reforms in Korea, where the National Assembly enacted the Yellow Envelope Act. And while this is generally seen as a good thing, labor unions like the Youth Community Union are critical towards these changes because they have not been recognized as a traditional union. So that forces them to develop new tactics such as bargaining with city governments and addressing broader social issues that go beyond the workplace. And what I think is really encouraging about the Korean case is that youth are creating new models that are suited to 21st century work realities, despite some cultural barriers to collective action. And if we compare that to Europe, European youth are also trying to challenge unions as they are now, and are trying to force them to adapt to new work conditions such as freelance and remote work. And initiatives such as the Youth Engagement Workshop, which is like a cross-national workshop that has been done for the first time this year, showcase how young Europeans really want to show solidarity as kind of a European Union.
Oh, wow, thank you. Alanya, do you personally feel that labor unions are necessary in today's working environment?
I think workers' rights will always remain relevant and they are never guaranteed fully. So that is why we always have to advocate for them. Nothing is set in stone. And as we can see through the pandemic, economic instability, and especially the rise of AI, workers' rights and jobs will always be in danger. And I think the young generation has a duty to make sure that their own rights are realized. So I believe that labor unions act as a crucial entity in ensuring the protection that workers need. And yeah, it will always stay relevant.
I think you shared a lot of interesting points with us. For example, young people, no matter where they're from, they just want things to reflect the realities of their workplace today. So thank you so much for sharing your insight with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity to discuss.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we just heard from a young person studying in the Netherlands about how young workers there are getting involved in unions, and it really shows how different regions approach labor issues in their own ways and also their similarities there. So given this perspective we just heard from someone studying in Western Europe, I'm curious, how does the situation compare to in the US in terms of young worker involvement in unions?
So young Americans have also become very highly active in organizing unions in recent years. So millennials and Gen Zs have led efforts to unionize workplaces like Starbucks, Apple stores, and Amazon warehouses. While overall public support for unions in the US sits around 60%, among people under 30, it's close to 80%. And the main issues fueling this activism are stagnant wages, rising living costs, unfair dismissals, and the overuse of part-time and temporary contract workers.
So when wages can't keep up with inflation, job stability feels uncertain, it makes sense that more young people see unions as a tool for protection. So from what you've seen, what about young workers in Europe? What kind of issues are they focused on, Seung?
Well, I haven't lived in Europe myself, but from what I've heard from friends who have, young workers there tend to take a more issue-based approach instead of just joining large traditional unions known for strong labor actions. Many young workers are organizing around new kinds of workplace rights, things like protections for platform workers, flexible or remote work policies, or climate-related labor issues, and even digital labor rights.
So based on all the things we've talked about today, this is a bit of a hard question to answer, but what do young worker-led unions do you think need to do in order to stay sustainable?
Just to break it down into two things, I think one, they need continued member engagement because ultimately unions are run by their members' attention, participation, and trust. And if that runs out, the organization weakens quickly. And second, they need the ability to negotiate effectively and efficiently with the management, turning members' priorities into real workable agreements as on payments, working hours, and protections is what keeps unions credible and worth staying.
I think that was well said. So what are your thoughts on this?
Going forward, young worker-led unions need to find ways to coexist with traditional labor groups, not just compete with them. And if they focus only on representing MZ interests, the risk is that labor disputes could turn into conflict between generations. And I also believe that we should remember that many rights we take for granted today were actually earned by workers who fought for them before us.
Right. So young people aren't stepping away from labor issues. They're stepping into them in new ways. From the US to Europe to Korea, the message from young workers is quite clear. They want workplaces that reflect the realities of today. And as young worker-led unions continue to emerge, building cooperation with traditional unions rather than conflict will definitely be key to making these efforts sustainable. So that brings us to the end of today's episode of News Generation. But News Gen will be back tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. Korea time with more stories and discussions. A big thanks to Seong.
Thank you
For coming in, also Kyun.
So it's a pleasure.
And to our viewers, thank you so much for joining us, and we hope you have the best day. We are
News Generation.